Anyway, I'm really pleased to join all of you this morning. And I know that all of you are interested in innovation. And I've gathered that some of you are very familiar with Africa or bits of Africa, and some of you are not. So the first thing I'm going to tell you about, because I think that gives the context for what I'm going to talk about, is I'm currently the co-chair, well, I am the chair of an intergovernmental council at UNESCO, which is for a program called the Information for All program. And that program was started 20 years ago to encourage more equity and accessibility to the internet and to digitization in UN speak, to knowledge societies. And this year, we've seen that everybody has woken up to the fact that globally we have very unequal access. We have many, many issues around this. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you about. And given that we have a few people interested in education here, I will use education in Africa as a case study. And what I want to remind us about at the beginning is just how big Africa is. And I think all of you have seen those maps. I see somebody is sneezing. I hope it's not the beginning of anything serious.
It's because it's cold here.
Yeah, I'm so hot here. Anyway, yeah, looking at the continent, you know that we have about 30% of the world's mineral resources, that most of the rest of the world can fit into Africa. People always get the wrong impression from the maps, but you can actually fit most of the world into Africa. And there's some great maps online that will show you that, so I won't talk too much about it. But I think that what is really interesting for us is not only the mineral resources, not only the size of the continent, but to actually look at the human resource dimension on the continent. And we are supposed to have right now about 20% of the world's population or more under the age, between the ages of 15 and 24. And this is supposed to go up to about 42% by 2030. And when you look at innovation, you think of markets. So you realize that Africa is going to have the largest market in a very few number of years. But what's that market going to look like in reality? And I want to remind all of us that currently most children are not in school. You know, I realize that, I don't know, in Austria, did the children go back to school? Anybody can answer that for me. Are the Austrian children in school?
Some of them. So the graduating classes, and Dorothy, you probably know better, on the graduating classes.
The primary and secondary, are they in school? No.
Primary and secondary are in school, yeah. And
yeah, but
the 18 months, yeah.
In Africa, most children have been out of school since probably April, and they have not gone back to school. In Ghana, we're hoping that children will go back to school at the beginning of January. And discussing with my European counterparts, I realized that for many people, it's difficult for them to imagine the situation of those children. And I want to point you to a very good report, which is produced by the Web Foundation, A for AI, that part of Web Foundation, which is the accessibility report. And it documents how in Africa, first of all, most internet connections are on mobile. And you know that there are limitations to what you can do on mobile. You cannot write a 5,000 word essay on your mobile phone very easily. So there are limitations in terms of learning. But then you look at the cost of the bandwidth, and in many countries, it's up to about between 10 to 20% of average monthly income. So when you look at it that way, you see that many of the solutions which were used in other countries where they have better access to devices, they have better access to bandwidth, they are not actually feasible in this context. And you see that even in countries like Austria or other places, even in the US, you see there's still serious inequality in terms of access to devices, as well as the cost of the internet. And there's a wonderful photo online of a whole gang of children who are actually seated outside a Taco Bell in California trying to do their homework because they could access the internet from the Taco Bell and they didn't have access at home. So these are very serious issues. You can imagine that for 9 months, your kids have not been in school. It has had huge implications for the welfare of women. I think all of you know this already: increased violence against women, their inability to earn income because they have to look after kids, etc. But the thing about the children is the studies that we have show us that, and this is a study that came out of Oxford University, and it's based on the experience from Pakistan, where they had an earthquake earlier in this millennium. And they showed that even 2 years after the earthquake, the kids who were out of school were not able to catch up. And this is probably because the assumption was you bring them back to school and then you start them studying from where they left off. But of course, they've forgotten a whole lot of stuff. So that's in very general terms. But now let's look at it if we wanted to rapidly digitize education. And you see that that is happening, particularly for the more wealthy Africans. Everybody is trying to get online. And I don't work exclusively on Africa, I work globally. And sometimes it's more comfortable for me to give an example from another region. So if we look at the Middle East, for example, my information is that they've moved all government services onto the platform of a major OTT player. And that means that many of the smaller education apps that had been developed in the region have been crowded out completely, because now everything is taking place. It isn't Zoom, by the way, but everything is taking place on that platform. So we see many of these similar stories in Africa. When we look at our innovation ecosystems, it's very complicated because at one level, having OTT players can support rapid digitization. But at another level, if we don't have clear procurement guidelines in place and a clear vision in terms of supporting local startups and businesses, it can also crowd them out. And I want us to also remember that are there any economists here? Oh, good. Okay, one. But so let me phrase it a little differently. If you look at the amount of money that an average African country earns in 1 year, it doesn't match up to what a mid-sized town in Europe would earn. And yet when they're going to the market for educational solutions, they're very often paying the same amounts of money. And I had already described to you a situation where in economics, we talk about a dependency ratio. How many people who are not working are being supported by people who are working? And if you remember the proportion of people who are under 24, just between 15 and 24 in Africa, you see that we have a huge problem in dependency ratio. In Europe, you're worried about your aging society. In Africa, we're worried about how are we going to educate young people in Africa for a very complicated future using very few, the limited resources which are at our disposal. And Nikki knows that one of the things that I'm very keen on is open source technologies. And I truly believe that innovation ecosystems can benefit hugely from looking at the issues in education and seeing how we will develop localized solutions for them using these technologies. And as you know, open doesn't mean that it's free, but it just means that many more people can unpack the technologies, build on these technologies, use them. And of course, we also have something which we call open education resources that are, gaining more traction overall. So we have a global problem, but the problem is that much more intense in Africa. And if we have a problem, given the proportion of young people on our planet who will be African, this turns out to be then a global issue, particularly if we're looking at markets, because that means that those people who are innovating in Europe should be thinking about the African market as one important market for them. But if we're not able to organize ourselves so that the young people who are in school now can really benefit from a good education, that will also limit the markets in Europe. So I think I'll stop there and get a few questions and then we can continue. Marcus? I can't hear you.
No, I had to unmute.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm in London, UK, and I'm working in the education sector. I am an economist, I'm a chartered accountant. My background was real estate and then education through tech. The debate at the moment in the UK, and we've had a similar thing with kids, with schools being closed and students doing remote learning, some of whom were accessing it, some of whom were not. And the debate was not that they don't have the equipment, but they don't have the bandwidth, or actually they don't have access because the parents are using it.
Can I interrupt you and tell you that the other problem is they didn't have the right design of solution.
No.
The solutions were not designed for exclusively remote learning, and you can't get a 6-year-old to learn how to read doing that without a lot of support from parents. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so it's interesting, actually. We have a lot of work going on with early years. The later years, the United Kingdom has been, actually most countries have had some sort of testing as to whether education is working. And in general, that testing has been to test what you can remember, not what you can do with what you know. So it's not a test of ability to synthesize information, to use it, to act on it, but simply a test of what can you remember. And the debate in the UK at the moment is whether exams are even relevant or appropriate in order to determine the capability of a young person to make their mark in society. And that debate has moved towards, right now, are we going to have exams, or shall we just have teachers assessing what the likelihood of an exam pass would be? Which actually,
I remember, let me interrupt again, because maybe you don't know about this, the Austrians don't know, but this created a huge confusion in the summer. And another interesting area of my work on artificial intelligence, because they used an algorithm to predict grades, and teachers were ready to go on strike. And I support in Ghana, or I used to support, because I'm no longer on that board, I supported a school which is for girls in science. And it's a new school, it's only been around for 5 years. So the algorithm decimated their marks. And these are all brilliant kids who have been coached and normally enter the top universities, and the algorithm made them C students. And then when the teachers protested, they all became A students again. It was very interesting.
So the question which I had, so in our country, the debate, and it's really between the people in education saying no, exams are really important, and everybody else saying that's not important. What's important is what can people do, and how quickly can people learn new things, and how can people apply their knowledge, not can they remember stuff. It's the application of knowledge which is much more important than the acquisition of knowledge and the remembering stuff, because that's all been swept away with the internet. So that's the debate. So if I go, sorry?
Yeah, I said very interesting.
Yeah, so I will now go back to a bunch of young people in Africa and your comment upon how do we educate them? I suppose my question is, how should we be educating them? Let's abandon all the previous stuff. And if we were to start again, how would we help young people become the futures which they could be, as opposed to measuring and testing them on the methods of the past?
Let me hear from a couple other people and I'll get back to that, because actually that's the whole point of my talk today, the need to rethink education. And all of this was leading into it, but I would like to hear from others before we go a bit more in depth.
Well,
Yeah, Martin.
Yes, I have a question. You mentioned the term of innovation ecosystem. Could you explain it a little bit more on from your point?
Okay. Any other questions?
And what is especially, for example, in your country or in your region in this context?
Let's see, who have I got? Johan, any question?
Not really. I'm also involved in some of these aspects, and I also see the need to completely rethink the system and focus more maybe on the soft skills of people of these kids and so but no question at this stage.
Jonas, I didn't meet you at the beginning. I'm assuming you're also Austrian?
Right. I'm also one of part of the Moonshot Pirate Bootcamp with the innovation idea of regreening the desert. And yeah, no question for me this time. Or
regreening the desert.
Yeah, right.
So
with thermical and thermical principles, and yeah, it would be really great to turn this into a reality. And yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And
which I'm really curious about the regreening of the desert. What problem is it supposed to solve?
Actually, the global warming. Sorry, it's getting
okay.
The desert belt is growing to the north and to the south, and it's about to reconquer that space for the growing population.
Well, I worked on this issue for a number of years. I used to run a fund, a $25 million fund in the early 90s of the last century that was geared to greening of Africa. And you realize the complexity of the problem. But as I said at the beginning, population density is not an issue for most African countries. But there are a few like Rwanda where there's a very high population density, but many of our problems are actually related to low population densities that make it difficult to reach out. Nikki, Martin had a question about innovation ecosystems. I think that you can describe for me what it's like in Austria, and then I will tell him the difference with Africa.
So the Austrian, so I think the least common denominator of things that are happening in Austria can be called everyone is boiling their own broth. So there's nothing that's really connected. Everyone's doing their own thing, which makes a lot of tiny satellites with very little impact to the grand picture. I would say that's the Austrian situation.
Well,
it's good ideas, but they would always stay within. And there's a lot of envy and jealousy embedded in the Austrian culture, no one would let the other really grow.
I think Austrians are just behaving like normal human beings. But when I look at the innovation ecosystem here, we see, for example, in Ghana, we have about 16 hubs. We have a lot of great ideas, lots of people getting into startups, and then we also have support. For example, the German government supports a lot of startups here in Ghana. But what we realized, and some of the startups became very suspicious, because if they needed small amounts of money, like $20,000 to get bootstrap up, they could find that. But if they wanted to get money that would actually take them to become viable businesses, it was almost impossible for them to find that. And they did not have, we do have some support from governments, but not to any level that would make any difference into this. So if you look at the innovation ecosystem, there are lots of different stakeholders there. You have the people who are developing the new products, you have the people that are supposed to buy them. In Africa, government is the main procurer of goods and services. That means that, let's say, 70% on average of money spent within the economy is starting from government. So if you don't get government on board with you, it's going to be very difficult. And as I said, and maybe illustrated a little bit more, if you go to the corridors of our ministries before COVID, you would see very good looking men and women in suits from major tech vendors who were selling their wares. And I think that officials here are very similar to officials everywhere. Their actual grasp of how to implement technology is often very weak. And I used to think it was different elsewhere until I saw the Senate hearings for Facebook and Google. And I realized that if that was the level of understanding of American legislators, probably we are on par in Africa, but it doesn't make for good choice of solutions. And very often they will say that Africa is not actually ready, that we don't have the companies developed to the stage that we can actually provide the solutions. And I always say, well, you may not be ready today, but what are you putting in place so that you will be ready five years from now? And that is the challenge. What policies should we put in place? And we realized post-COVID that while we've been talking about a tech sector very much driven by private sector and major tech oligopolies, we must look at how we diversify that landscape if we're going to have robust and resilient systems as we move to the future. So what I'll do, Martin, because innovation ecosystems is a whole field, I can send to Nikki a link and you'll be able to see some really interesting graphics of innovation ecosystems with more than 100 different points that impact on the ecosystem. We always talk about, if you look at Silicon Valley, for example, people will tell you that it happened because of a good climate, because of some great universities over there. They attracted a whole bunch of startups. There was good money available that could give them the loans to get their businesses to develop. Venture capitalists were hanging around. All of these things make it complicated. But what I will tell you is I believe that it's more difficult to get real traction today than it was 15 years ago, because now we do have big players in the landscape. At the same time, we have, I don't know who now, I was participating in an event for the World Summit Awards earlier this week, and a very interesting new legislation in Germany came up, where the German government is actually registering apps for the health sector and allowing people to claim insurance for using those apps. And so they were discussing how Estonian app developers were now heading for the German market. I'm sure a lot of Austrians will be heading for the German market as well. So there are things that governments are doing that can support innovation ecosystems. Now, going back to rethinking education, I think all of us have to really think about this. And I'm also on the board of Unesco's Institute for Information Technology and Education. And what I can tell you is that these more, let's put it this way, a test-based rote learning system is easier to implement than a system where you're actually getting people to think. And in Africa, we have an additional problem in that many of us are being taught in a language which is not our language. For example, I started my life speaking Cree, and my father got a job in Europe when I was about 5, and my parents had to more or less force me to learn English super quick when I got to England. And then I was educated in English, both in the UK and in Ghana. And many of the kids are going to school in English with parents who don't speak English and are not able to support them in any way on their learning journey. I have driven around. I'm very passionate about education. And I drive around before COVID. I would just drive around, and if I see a school, I would enter the school and just ask permission to observe, sometimes from the veranda outside so I don't disturb the class, etc. And how many times I've observed a class and I've realized I don't understand what the teacher is saying, because they're speaking a hybrid of whatever local language is used there and their version of English, and I can't follow. And in the north of Ghana, for example, we have what are called shepherd schools. And they take out of school youth and they give them the equivalent of 6 years of education in 1 year. And when they are tested, they do better than the children who were in school for the 6 years. And I've looked at exercise books from grade 1, and I've looked at exercise books from grade 6, and I haven't been able to see any difference. no acquisition of knowledge in the 6 years. So I think we have to rethink education, and it's good that we get people to think, because most people don't like to think. You know, my impression, one of my degrees is in philosophy, and I always have to control myself when people are making what I would consider illogical arguments. Their sequence of thinking is not coming out the way we were trained in logic. Thinking is not something that comes, I don't know, I suppose it does come naturally to us, but disciplined thinking, critical thinking is something that has to be taught. And who's going to teach that? Is it going to be robots that are teaching these African kids? How are we going to retrain all of these teachers? We have been trying to retrain the teachers from normal technology, just being able to recognize a mouse and that kind of thing. We haven't been able to get them to the critical thinking skills, and nowhere has that happened yet. The shining star in education is always Finland. But even in Finland, it will be difficult to assess because we don't even know which metrics what units of measurement. How are we going to measure if somebody can think critically? You know, these are huge challenges, and I was just in a bit of a fight last week with a colleague from a very renowned professor from Hong Kong. We were looking at the latest OECD report on education and its implications. And I was saying that my nightmare is that recommendations coming out of studies from OECD countries will be applied without adjustment to African countries. So I want you to imagine that you are the president of an African country. Your budget right now in Ghana, we spend about 30% of the government budget on education, or 20, I can't remember, 20 or 30. Out of that 20%, let's assume 20%, 98% of it goes to pay teacher salaries. So that means that there is no money for buying chalk, equipment. Marcus was talking about getting a granite stone, which actually shouldn't be a challenge. You go walking and you go in the right area and you can pick it up, you know? So how in that context are you going to guarantee that you give people the right education? And talking about the regreening of the desert, I buy it if it is for climate change control, but I think there are so many other things that we could be doing in terms of our lifestyles, our consumption patterns that could really make a contribution. You know that in Brazil, Bolsonaro is going completely crazy when it comes to the destruction of the Amazon. Fixing the Sahel and the Sahara is going to be a huge challenge. I don't know how it's going to be paid for and who's going to do it. But in Africa, we've become very nervous about solutions that get teleported from other regions without due consultation on the ground and without in-depth involvement of people on the ground. You know, when I used to teach, I always used to ask people to imagine if somebody sailed into their country to do the same thing. What would be the reaction of local people? You know, and I think that helps because as we are innovating, it doesn't matter whether it is to do with the greening of the desert or fixing an educational system. the consultation with stakeholders and the ability to have iterative design and figure, okay, this is the solution I'm trying right now, but this is what I put in place in case it doesn't work, so that I will change it and reorient it, is really, really important. So now let me take some more questions.
Dorothy, I have a question. There's this Palau, I think, the story of this island. You remember when you might remember the analogy of blockchain, this island in the Yak Island to have the sandstone, and everyone was engraving into the sandstone the fraction of the stone that belongs to that person. So when someone went for, I don't know, potatoes, they went to this place where the sandstones were, and they would engrave in the sandstone that this part of the sandstone now belongs to the other person because he traded it for potatoes. And this is basically the hands-on explanation how blockchain functions. Where I'm going is that they've developed their own currency. So if there is no central budget, what I see a lot is that regions develop who have their own infrastructure actually, and could be autark, develop their own currency of trading. Because if they don't get money from outside, they develop their own thing where they can keep on flourishing and trading within their own ecosystem. Is this something that you see as a possibility that African regions will pop up and will come up and make their own currency to develop from within?
I think that making their own currency, that's happening already. Cryptocurrencies are already taking off. Some countries have already developed them. There's some talk of developing them within the framework of some of the regional banks, etc. But what you are talking about is, for me, a version of isolationism, that you will trade within Africa and you will not connect to the rest of the world. In Africa at the moment, we're working very hard to improve the amounts of trade within the region. And that includes trade in digital services and solutions. There's a new African trade body that's been set up with the headquarters in Accra. But right now, if we look at the Ghanaian economy, we see a lot of, a high proportion of our products go to Europe. And I think the major people investing in Ghana, it's always changing, but the last time I checked, it was the Indians and the Chinese who are investing here. So it's a very interesting situation. We're seeing the influence of Europe declining rapidly. And what happened is the Europeans tried to get us to sign some agreements that would tie us in to a certain level of trade with Europe. But I don't think anyone in Africa is thinking of isolating the continent from the rest of the world. That is not the way the world is going at the moment.
I didn't mean the whole country, I meant regions within the country when there is no central budget, that there would be regions that walk together and find our own way of trading.
In one way, I agree with you, because when we are looking at this whole education issue and access to bandwidth, etc., we're looking at how people could have community networks and community caching of key resources, so that you're not, downloading from the internet every time you need some information. We realize that most of the information on the internet is not actually relevant to African communities. And so they're going to have to do a lot of content creation at that local level to make it relevant. When you're educating kids who live in a community where farming is popular, it makes sense to put more emphasis on agriculture than you would in an urban environment. So we're looking at solutions that are more tailored to needs. But then you look at the whole huge administrative thing of that and how you maintain certain quality standards when you're making all of those transitions, it's going to be really complicated. I don't know, Dorothy, do you have any ideas?
About fixing it?
Fixing education. You look young. You recently got out of education if you're not still there. If
I'm
you
still
have
there.
to fix it, what would you do?
I would focus on not having any tests or any checkups to test the knowledge of the children. I would combine it with some real practice, because we sitting in school or now in front of the laptop and we hear all of the stuff we have to learn, and we're sitting there and thinking, for what? And we don't know how to use it, and that's the big problem of our system, I think.
Yeah, I would
use it.
agree with you 100%. I mean, but I know that I was supposed to be a very good student, but that's because I have a very good memory. So as long as I wasn't sleeping in class, I could kind of remember what they said. And then my father was a university lecturer. So he also explained to me how they construct tests so that you will recognize from how they're teaching what's likely to come up on the test. So testing for me was much easier than for other kids. But I know that without the test, I wouldn't have made any effort at all, you know? So whenever you talk about tests and throwing away tests, I'm like, okay, but then, you know, I remember my niece when she was 7, she got a note from her teacher because the teacher asked the 7-year-olds, would you rather stay in class, we do some fun reading, or would you rather go to the playground? And they all voted playground. And she wrote a note complaining to my sister that the kid was not serious about studying. And I was like, if you give anybody the choice of fun versus education, structured learning, where they didn't choose what to learn, they will opt for their normal leisure activity. So how are we going to get the kids motivated in these new systems? I'm sure, Marcus, you have an idea.
I have a question. I have a quick fix suggestion. I'm curious what you think about it. And I feel like it's a quick fix because you don't change anything. So you keep the teachers and you keep the tests and you keep the people in class and you keep the curriculum. The only thing that you change, because I think, and that's also something that I know Marcus thinks as well, because we had that conversation, that one of the biggest problems, if not the biggest problems, is the teachers. So we have to design intrinsic motivation to make a teacher a good teacher. And that would be if we keep everything the same, but the result for every individual student at school would mean, so if I get a 5 out of 5, so worse, in Austria 5 is worse than 1 is best. So if I get a 5 in Austria, it means an equal part that the student missed to learn and the teacher missed to teach in a way that it's attractive to learn for the student. So it would be a mark for both. And a 1, so very good, would mean that the teacher was very good in making it exciting for the student, and the student was very good in learning and taking it in, and everything in between. And you
What
would
do you think?
with
What do
every
you
mark
think,
you would give.
Jonas?
Say again.
I was just asking Jonas what he thinks of this solution that you're offering.
What was this again, please?
Basically, he's saying that you have to retrain the teachers.
Yeah,
and when
right.
you do the evaluation of the student, the student's result is tied to an evaluation of the teacher as well. Is that a good summary, Marcus?
Well, sort of. I would go back a little bit, and because we're talking to you, Dorothy, with your knowledge of Africa, I would put it to you that a lot of the global education systems arose from the need to train people to be compliant workers. So the British system, the German system, the United States system.
Industrial Revolution.
It's about compliance.
Yeah.
I will teach you to do stuff. I want to know that you've learned this enough so you can do it. Africa Africa had a lot of colonial influence. And I'm just wondering whether that huge influence and legacy of all this stuff, which in my country we're saying is totally wrong, to have people who are compliant, when what we want to do is people who are going to work out where the new future is, which doesn't mean do what's always been done. That's our debate. Maybe Africa, with your young people, should move away from the old compliance-based systems and demonstrate there's a new way. Because after all, you've got nothing to lose.
Well, first of all, let me get back to Jonas and then I'll get back to you. So Jonas, what do you think?
I think teachers have a huge impact of us and how we gonna repeat this information they said. But I also think that we kind of changed the system of school, because many subjects in school are unnecessary, I think, because we already learned it and we repeat this again and again and again. And it's kind of both. I think bit change the system and to retrain the teachers from my
Yeah, I really like what you said, because it reminded me of when I went to high school in the US. I was shocked that for the 4 years of high school, they only learned American history, and the same American history for 4. It was just incredible for me. You're right, but let me get back to Marcus's very interesting question. You have to realize that, you know, we have a situation which is called neocolonialism. And neocolonialism means that the colonizer theoretically left, but they retain control of your economy and they retain control of your systems. And this is generally true in Africa. Neocolonialism, and you can read lots on neocolonialism, even from Kwame Nkrumah, our first president, very good books on it. But going back also to the discussions that Marxist theory comes up with, you always have people who are invested in the current system who will lose from if that system changes. So, and frankly, African elites are very much invested in these kind of mirrored educational system, where a university in Ghana, like the University of Ghana where I went, it's modeled on Oxford and Cambridge, etc. And it's only after independence that we actually established a University of Science and Technology, because before they were all studying Latin and Greek and other kinds of stuff. But we have an elite now. And if you look at what happens within our educational system, the people who are in the elites, those people, they speak English, they have money to send their kids to private schools. They end up getting all the university places locally. And they want a system that is going to be make it easy for their children to transfer to universities in other countries. You know, even in my case, when my daughter was going to go to university, there was a crisis in education in Ghana, and most children were set 2 years back because they were changing systems with different years. You know, high school was 7 years, and then it became 6. And so you had 2 cohorts at the same time wanting to enter university, and they had a whole complicated system for dealing with that. I simply sent her to Canada. And because she had done an international baccalaureate, she could easily go to Canada and avoid being back 2 years of her life. I was very insistent on that, because for women, if you take them out of school, their chances of going back to school, even with all encouragement, etc., are far less robust than that for men. So yes, I think that we have an opportunity, Marcus. We have a great opportunity in Africa to rethink education, but we shouldn't imagine that because it makes sense that everybody is going to buy into this. There are entrenched interests in perpetuating the status quo, and that status quo is linked globally. So let me just take one element. I see we don't have much time, and I want to call on Bridget, Bogdan and Juliana, who were not on my screen. That's why I've been kind of not calling them. But I want you to just think about technology and what I was saying about the ecosystem, and to encourage you to look at a new concept, which is techno-colonialism or techno-imperialism, where all the key systems of a country are taken over by non-national players, who then in effect control the data of the country, and they are able through behavior modification or whatever to influence even the democratic process. But just rounding up on this education issue, my goal today was to get all of you to start thinking about this, and thinking about it not only for your context, but being aware of what it means for Africa with this huge number of young people that need to be educated, and they need to be educated in such a way that they can earn a good living so that they don't end up migrants drowning in the Mediterranean, etc. So Bogdan and Julien, you've been very quiet. Could I have some comments from you before we finish up? Bogdan, I see you said hi.
Yes.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. So thanks for this presentation. Indeed, I have a very low bandwidth for my internet. I'm in a country outside Europe, and internet connection is not very good. But
Where
I
are you?
followed the presentation, and actually, I created a school 6 years ago, weekend school. In The Hague, in the Netherlands, and the fact that this school is a private school and do not have to follow some strict regulations, we could use a lot of freedom in order to create the curricula and to create the dynamic we want to have with our pupils, with the children. And during those years, together with a team of teachers, we could develop a program focused on personal development. And I think that's one of the keys of the future schooling system, is to integrate, first of all, the children as a first clients, as a first beneficiary of this system, to focus on them, on their interest, to associate them to the learning process, and also to offer them the possibility to access to some skills which will be of more interest for them now and in their own future. Because as you know, with the development of artificial intelligence and all the tools, or part of them you just mentioned before, actually the professional landscape in short term even will be very different from what our parents saw and what we see today. And I think our duty is to try to prepare in the best possible manner the children for their own future, for their own life, actually. And from this perspective, I think we should focus more on tools and methods linked with aspects like emotional intelligence, soft skills, because the machines will continue to be more and more experts in different technical fields, faster, cheaper than humans. And I think we should be able to build a future where humans can use the data from those systems and to build something useful for the humanity. And right now, what I see, I have 3 kids in normal schools, and what I see in all schools that I considered so far, they unfortunately castrate the creativity of the children. And that's why we focus so much also on developing their own creativity. So I don't want to take more of your time, but I think the key words here for me would be creativity, would be soft skills, would be emotional intelligence as tools, as skills to help the children, our children today, to become individuals tomorrow, adults in their own life with different life, professional life, with different needs. So thanks for the presentation.
I wish you had come in earlier. It would have been really interesting to go into more depth in terms of that school. I will just say that I'm still thinking about this. It's not an easy solution that, we can come up with just like that. It's going to take a whole lot of people thinking about this in a very systematic way before we can come up with the solutions. But what I will say, one, soft skills, fine. But I really think that we need to put a lot more emphasis on logic and mathematical thinking, because maths teaches you logic. If you can, I have found it extremely helpful that in my early years, I did a lot of mental math. When I compare myself with other people who didn't do mental math, like my younger relatives, I found mental math really helped. And I think you need some level of mathematical skills, especially if you're going to be coding the AI that is taking over all the other jobs. But on a more social level, I think that we have a model right now which says that the responsibility for education lies with the government and the private sector and formal systems of education. It doesn't take into account the role of parents. And so what I would love is that anybody who is leaving school by age 18 would have already been trained in how to educate a kid with the basics and the logic of education, because most of them are going to have children and most of them should play a role in the education of their kids. So to have a more socially integrated approach to education that shifts, that gives more responsibility to the family, I think is very important. Exactly which subjects we will talk about, I think we will keep debating that. And I want to thank you all. I found it really interesting. It's an interesting group. Thank you, Nikki, for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. I think in UN terms, Her Excellency, Mrs. Chairman, Dorothy Gordon. Thank you so much for the broad, introduction that you have at the United Nations. I was giving a talk at the UN in Vienna years ago, and I felt like everyone, before they started talking, they had like 3 minutes of just formal introduction phrases and formulas that they were using. It was a very interesting experience.
Yes, how to waste time.
That last hour was the opposite of waste time. It was so much full of wisdom and insights and wise thinking. Thank you so much for this.
I am sorry I don't have the answers yet, but I'll keep thinking.